you've hit on a really interesting aspect that FM in this whole area, once the building is completed and once it's taken over, and along comes facilities management who take on the responsibilities and in some of them legal responsibilities, the regularity of testing or maintenance and checks, and it is an area that there's some very responsible companies in that space, but I suspect that there isn't a collective understanding.
No.
As there is in the fire sector of what now needs to be done. And perhaps we have a responsibility as the fire sector to make sure they do and can and work together with that wider sector that's going to ensuring the continuing safety of people and the safety of the building.
Yeah, and of course, the regulatory reform order has been with us a long time now, and the responsible person is the responsible person. And I think I'm always amazed sometimes within certain sectors of the lack of understanding of even that, and that's been around now for a significant number of years. And who is the responsible person? You'd be amazed at certain businesses and have multiple buildings that things like supermarkets where the store managers aren't necessarily that well adversed with their level of responsibility under that order, and it is quite. I'm not saying it's frightening, but it's concerning that that message still doesn't. It's not either communicated to them or they haven't understood it themselves. But no, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility, to manufacture and install things to push down. As much as you say, the fire and rescue service, has a responsibility to push up, because of course. The fire and rescue service is more than just a fire and rescue service now. It does so many other things, doesn't it? And people don't always appreciate that. They think that it's just a bunch of men and women who turn up in a big red truck with some blue lights flashing on it and solve problems at the point of demand, as opposed to all the stuff you don't see going on when they're not doing that. And
well, I mean, we're sort of drifting into the fire and rescue service, a role I know pretty well, but it really is that the bit you've just described is the last resort if everything goes
absolutely,
wrong.
Yeah.
The front end really is protection and prevention.
Yeah.
Prevention before fires occur and what you can do to avoid prevent a fire, which is incredible, and a legal responsibility placed on the fire and rescue service, by the way.
Yeah.
And of course that protection with those fire engineering skills and fire engineering advice and enforcement that's also applied. But when things do go wrong and when things are wrong, and they're not just in fire, are they? Then the fire and rescue service is there to do that bit as well. So it is multifaceted, but bridging all of those three pillars is important to give the credibility for the fire and rescue service to be able to advise and work as part of the fire sector.
It is. I'm always interested to see, or when I talk to people about their expectation, as you say, they only really understand the bit at the end when something has happened, as opposed to all of the things that happen or try to happen to prevent like you say, the last resort from happening. So just staying on the subject of formalities of requirements and standards and code. There's some news came out, or there was a proposal that came out a few weeks ago, or was certainly looking for a public, I think there was a requirement to respond, I think by the end of March, in terms of the proposal to remove the I say old, but the historic British BS 476 standards from approved document B, and align more to classification standards, which personally, from my past, that I was more used to working with testing to European standards and classifying to them, as opposed to 476 standards. For me, were always something that sort of sat within the page 2 of a CE mark standard, under normative references, because of course there was a significant element of those old standards sitting within the new CE mark standards. What are your thoughts on this proposal, and what do you think the ramifications, either as loss or benefit, would be if they were removed?
Well, it has been an interesting conundrum, hasn't it? Because you just described it precisely, that this has been a discussion that's been a long time coming, because it's been 20 years, including your own organisation, is actively involved in? Is it Euroclass, or is it the withdrawn British Standard 476 in fire? And of course, the inquiry, its public inquiry itself, Grenfell, brought that to a head.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting at the moment, because having moved from, as a result of the EU decisions on behalf of the UK decisions to remove itself from the EU, we've of course equally moved from CE marking to UKCA, although that's been a bit of a tortuous journey.
I think it's still,
it's been
pushed out a few times now, hasn't it?
And still is.
Yeah.
And so you could argue that actually there's, if that was part of that debate, you'd said, well, now that we're not doing CE marking, why do we need to do it at all? Might as well stay with the British Standard 476 and say that. I don't hold that view. And I think most people will see what you've inferred, the sense of moving to Euroclass generally in those and the fire testing standards. But there are challenges. There are challenges, particularly in the British industry and especially the fire door industry. And although the government started the consultation, I think that's moved across the building safety regulator to, as I understand it, to determine now. But I'm hearing, I'm more concerned that the transition should be properly handed from saying it to making it happen, because the history of the transition from CE to UKCA has not been great, as we've had extension after extension for British industry. And I think the same industry and the limitation on test houses, the capacity of test houses to retest products to a different standard, it's not a new standard, but a new classification standard, will be immense. And my conversations I've had with parts of the industry that I've spoken to that have support for the principle, but concern about the implementation, would suggest, and I don't want to pluck figures out of the air, because having waited 20 years, what's another 1, 2, 3 or 4 or 5 years, would suggest it's probably a transition is more likely to be 5 years. As reasonable in order to get us from now into the full-blown change.
Yeah, and I think like any project, add 25% to any facet of it in terms of time or cost. I think it's an interesting challenge, because we know that the laboratories, and there is only so many laboratories with so many furnaces that are capable and certified to testing certain things. We know that they have been pretty much at capacity since Grenfell, and that's companies retesting things. And I don't want to go into the whys and the wherefores of why they're doing that, but clearly it created an awful lot of demand. And of course, with classification schemes, it's not just the test. It then needs to go to a certifying body. And that test report needs to be assessed against the test method standard and the classification standard, to then issue a classification certificate against that product that's been tested. Now, if you talk to any of the certification bodies, they're all desperately trying to recruit, and the paperwork on their in tray is growing exponentially to the stuff that's in their out tray. So even if you get your test slot and you test successfully, we know that the lead times for then getting your report back from the certification body is running into months. It's not, you won't get it back in 2 weeks. You'll get it back in 3 months, 4 months, 5, 6 months. So they have a capacity issue as well.
So I'm aware of that, and that lag between testing and it's more than the paperwork arriving. It's not certified. You can't backdate that until you get that.
Absolutely.
And that's also delaying contractors, of course, because they may have won the contract, but they can't actually start the work until they've got that final piece in the jigsaw.
Yeah.
And so adding to that, in that piece, to add to that a new burden of a new range of products, an existing range of products which need different testing and certification. So I'm pretty sure that both the government department and the building safety regulator, you can test that on some of your other podcast victims, of course. But
a victim is a good word for an ASFP podcast guest.
but I think it's one of those issues of the moment, and I think worthy of follow up.
You can't switch one thing on and another thing off like a light switch. There's got to be a reasonable, significant amount of time for consultation, creating awareness and understanding of what's required, allowing the industry to then facilitate the requirements of that change, and that is something that, as you say, and you said 5 years. Coming from a previous life of most of our time spent testing, retesting, testing for new markets, testing variations, extended applications on products, or to in terms of part of developing a new standard within the industry, it takes years. And of course, you're relying on passing that test. I'm proud to say that I've been involved in tests that have gone way over 4 hours. I'm also slightly proud to say that I can say that I've failed a test in under a minute, and of course the laboratory will still want their £25,000 for me failing in a minute. So not only are we relying on the capacity of labs and cert bodies, but you're relying on the fact that all of these companies are actually going to pass the test to the criteria that's within the standard.
Well, that's why those that are making that decision, whether it's in government or building safety regulator, need to listen to the industry and the realism of that. Because of the temptation of it being raised to public inquiry, and a public inquiry probably coming to its outcomes this year, would be tempted to treat it in that light switch moment that you talk about, which frankly won't work.
No.
So I'm hoping, from where I stand, is the industry itself, like the ASFP, will be able to very positively offer to government the assistance of the outcome of the consultation, and finding the transition period that's right to not suffer the fate of UKCA and UKCA from CE.
Yeah, I think it's got to be properly managed. Saying that, it does. I think the view is that it should move over to classification. It's a better system than, and I've got a lot of old relationships with people that where my customers, and their biggest complaint was historically that somebody gives them a test report in a folder. Let's stay on the subject of 476. They give them a 476 20 or 22 test report. Now, somebody in procurement is not qualified in reading a test report, because the way the test reports are written, the one that you failed in the first minute looks exactly the same as the one that says you went to 4 hours 15 minutes. You just need to look on page 17 and the bit that says when the test was stopped due to whatever failure criteria was applicable to the test. And that's a problem, because historically we know that test reports are, in that traditional guise, is reliant on the person reading, being given them, who's making a procurement decision, being able to read them and understand them. And that clearly we know hasn't happened.
But there's a critical piece of information that you and I probably don't have a handle on at the moment, because in the last few hours, the Morale Day report was published, which was on testing. It's a long time coming to publication, but welcome as it is. Now, I have to say, because it's been the last few hours, I haven't read the whole report yet.
No.
But I think it's worthy of a careful read to see the implications of that report, which is very thorough. I have a copy of the report. It's online. It's been published by the Department of Levelling Up in the last few hours. I think it's worthy of the industry itself looking at the implications of that, both in testing in principle and this issue in particular, because it may, and I can't say that it does because I haven't read the whole report, only the executive summary, but it is worthy of a careful read and discussion within the industry.
And I think that will play a significant part in where this, the removal of the proposal of removing 476 from ADB and UKCA. And I think possibly the answer is that, whatever stage UKCA is at, and clearly we know that it's been pushed out a couple of times because of the complexity and the difficulties of trying to, bring it to a conclusion. And this issue with 476, whether they decide to run them sort of concurrently as part of the same project, but certainly that report the industry has been waiting a significant amount of time for that, and that report is purely based on looking at the testing regime of construction products, if I remember rightly.
Yes.
And what that looks like. So, we're an advocate at the ASFP of third-party certification. You can't be an ASFP member unless you are third-party certified to your products or your service provision. Saying that, we also recognise that third-party certification is not a panacea to all the problems and woes that we know that we have to resolve.
And I believe, I did look down the contributors, which are significantly number and significant in who they are. And I think ASFP were a contributor to the report as well, looking at the end of the report of who the contributors were. So well done on that, because that's about the industry playing a key part in change. But I hesitate to pontificate on a report I haven't read.
No, and absolutely, and we shouldn't because we've not read it, and I've not read it either. I do know that the ASFP technical officers, as we speak, are thumbing their way through it with gusto and a highlighter pen.
I reckon probably even with the authors will be good, but the ASFP is well placed to run a webinar.
And we'll run a webinar and we will comment on it and give our views on it. And we will also, obviously, we will offer, as we always do, our services to support anything that takes us in the right direction. But it is an interesting dichotomy, and I think all of these things. I think the phrase I would use is that we have to be sensible. We have to. It has to be evolution, not revolution. Some things have to be revolutionary, and we know they're going on and they're taking place, and we absolutely it is the right thing to do. But also, some of this has evolved over a long period of time to a point that we now need to evolve to somewhere else from. And I think evolution opposed to revolution is probably is the more realistic way we have to go with this. So it's an interesting one. But I mean, and just talking about one of the requirements that we know is going to, and I think this report may obviously add to that conversation, is the requirement, and I think it came, and absolutely correct me on this one, the requirement of critical life safety construction products to be all effectively third-party certified. I think that came out of, it was a comment came out of Michael Gove's Levelling Up department. I suppose there's a couple of pressures on that. Some of the industries within critical life safety products within construction are very small. They maybe only have half a dozen significant players in them, as in manufacturers or installers. And of course, you're relying on third-party certification, which in the predominance relies on third-party companies, commercial companies, to provide the testing and the certification schemes for those. And if, of course, a percentage of the overall construction products industry may not be commercially attractive to test and run a scheme for that part of it, it does pose a bit of a dichotomy because you end up with 90% of the critical life safety products sector within construction having schemes for them, and a smaller percent, this back end percentage where it maybe isn't commercially attractive to operate schemes, being left without a scheme to support them as a third party scheme. I don't know the answer to that because we've been thinking about this amongst ourselves here. And the only solution we can think of is that either it become, the government picks something up to run a department that runs schemes, or overarches obviously UKCA is the overarching body over the certifying bodies. But if you're reliant on commercial businesses to cover all bases on what is a requirement coming out of government, that does seem to pose a bit of a pinch point.
Well, it does, and I again, I don't want to duck the point you're making, because you made it very eloquently, and of course ASFP is well placed because of your policy on third party certification for picking up some of that issue. I don't think it will be government personally, because I don't think that is either in principle the role of government or the government's wish to be taking that lead. I think they'll want industry to take the lead. But the reason why I didn't want to comment on the detail is that I'm absolutely sure there'll be commentary on that in the report we've just talked about.
Yeah.
And the Paul Morell and Day report will actually have covered that. And I'm pretty sure when I looked through the headings, because I said it's hours old, I saw questions about UKCA or commentary about UKCA and just that point. So I'm hoping we'll find some of those observations in there. I hope there'll be answers, but at least they'll raise the challenges that you've done. I'm sure they will have done, because I think it was a very thorough investigation.
these are questions that are being raised to us by from outside the ASFP. I mean, the ASFP is very accessible. People contact us through our website. They contact us through our social media platforms, which this will appear on. The people engage with us at trade shows. So next week, and this will date mark it for you viewers. Next week is fire safety event in Birmingham, and people come up to us with these questions and concerns, and hopefully, as you say, and we're not going to comment on it because it was only published last night, but hopefully this will give us a much better understanding of where how these pressures can be managed, because we see an awful lot of requirement, and we as an association are always trying to accommodate these requirements. But sometimes, it's you're looking for a bit more of an answer on some of these things, and this hopefully will give us that answer.
If what we've been talking about is the picture on the box and the jigsaw, then this is a corner piece.
Yes.
And actually, that's why I'm really delighted it's been published after such a long time, which we've been waiting for.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry that I haven't come here today with a better understanding of what's in it. But I really think we should spend some time on it.
Absolutely.
Just to see where if it is the corner piece we're looking for in that jigsaw.
Indeed.
And I suspect it is one of the corner pieces.
Well, at least it's not missing out the box.
That's it.
At least it's there.
That's true.
And we look forward to obviously doing it. We may regroup on this one, Ken, and talk about it again. So we're happy to do that. So just moving on to a slightly different one, and still was in the news where it was proposed or has been proposed that in terms of future buildings of multiple occupancy, high-rise buildings, the single staircase is no longer permissible, and it's it has to a minimum of two. That's an example of future-proofing, future design and construction. I'm sure many of the buildings that would benefit from that, it would be very difficult to retrospectively, fit an additional staircase. And, I know Grenfell was a single staircase building, and there's probably lots of, mid-60s, where that style of sort of brutalist architectural, tall building, it must be practically impossible to try and fit second staircases to these. Clearly, second staircases is a practical and the right thing to do for all of the reasons that you probably have a far greater understanding than I do. But are there any other similar exampple to that we think we should be petitioning to invoke change?
You make an assumption there on my behalf that two staircases are the panacea, and they're not necessarily, of course. They've still got more than one staircase. They've still got single points of failure between the staircases, and brutally, what they require is the passive fire protection to be right in the first place. But that's no less true of a single staircase building and people understanding the fire strategy. So I am very conscious that suggesting that two staircases is the panacea and the answer to building safety wouldn't be entirely true. I was looking at fairly recently at a fire tragedy in Chicago, which was a multiple staircase building in which people died in a high-rise building. So it doesn't mean to say that the building is not at risk from fire, and indeed it can complicate, you think I would welcome it. I know that the NFCC has, and we're in the middle of consultation, of course, government consultation. So in amending the approved document, I am more inclined still to move to that, to stay with that assumption that Dame Judy has stayed with, and I'm happy with, which is not to arrive at too many prescriptive arrangements, but to allow the innovation and the fire engineering solutions to flourish. That fire engineering is not as a result of a failure of design or a failure of architecture. It's a key part of design. We wouldn't have had many of our innovative buildings, our large buildings, our large warehouse shopping buildings, without fire engineering.
Of course.
So to go back to design principles that are prescriptive would deny us that. And it does also rely, a single staircase, of course, particularly in high-rise residential buildings and medium-rise, on everyone being very clear of what the fire strategy is and the fire strategy in the event of a fire. So I think that passive fire protection throughout the building that is designed to allow free escape from fire, understanding the principles is the predominant feature, rather than finding there's a single technical solution that would make people safe.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, because they're all dependent and interdependent on each other, aren't they?
And even that linking between staircases, if you had more than one staircase, does require that interlinking also to be ensuring that the compartmentation is sound. Otherwise, you compromise both staircases. So I think before jumping at the solution that suggests that two sounds better than one, therefore make it two, it isn't necessary. It's a too simpler equation. There are other parts of that equation that rely on this, that result in the safety of the occupants.
Yeah, and like with all of these things, there's the equation of the law of unintended consequences. Without, if these things aren't properly considered, you're just talking about allowing innovation in design, and of course, most architects probably lie in bed at night dreaming of winning the RIBA Building of the Year award, and that's what drives the design, as opposed to the practical and functional and everything else that relates to actually how you build it. But of course, at the moment, we're seeing, in terms of the housing crisis, we're seeing, there was a press release the other day from government, I think, saying that, the answer is the modular and volumetric industry. And of course, we work very closely with that industry. Interesting to observe that they don't really use the word construction. They use the word manufacture and assemble. So it's a very, very different sort of mindset that they have. But of course, like with all of these things, and like with a large acceleration of a particular sector of industry or in technology, the modular and volumetric industry are involved not just in housing, but of course they build, or they manufacture and assemble significant commercial, public access, buildings other than dwellings. And in terms of how they are designed, passive fire, we were talking about the importance of passive fire, and, in terms of staircases. Passive fire is a consideration that they're working with the likes of ASFP on. Do you have a view on these modern technologies for construction and whether they create a future risk if we don't manage their design?
I think modern methods of construction as a term is a bit of a misnomer, because it's been at least 20 years or so.
Some of us still remember driving around Birmingham as a child in the 70s and still seeing loads of prefabs on what were bomb sites, one assumes, and they stayed for years, didn't they? And of course, prefab is
volumetric. But not quite volumetric, as built on the site. First of all, I don't think it might sound, it is rather fanciful to wish that modern methods of construction or volumetric construction didn't happen, because it will.
Of course it will,
and indeed it's important both to meet the needs of the country, not least the housing needs, and indeed net zero requirements. So there's absolutely a case. The other case, of course, is to ensure that in doing that, they're also structurally safe and safe to be in or to live in. And I think that's the piece that we need to. So I wouldn't at all be in the camp that somehow against modern methods of construction or volumetric construction in the way that it's being developed. But I think a better engagement and thinking through what that means in safety terms, in fire in particular, is the key. And I don't sense that's not happening.
No. It's we know it is happening because we're engaged,
and I think that's going to be important.
And the significant businesses in that sector are very much engaged with that, and they're engaged with us, and they understand that, I suppose, their technological growth can't outrun the requirements of approved document A, B, and all of the others, and that's why they are very, very mindful of that. Interestingly, they are an industry that is very much more cooperative than you may think or see as other industries. They are very engaged with each other, even though they effectively commercially compete with each other. And they do work on the principle that if one of them fails, they'll all be seen to fail. They're very conscious that they are seen as one industry. And we've been doing some significant work with them on passive fire within modular and volumetric. The timber construction with panelisation is a slightly different sector and doesn't really, they would, and we've had this debate with them as to actually, and you could talk for hours on this subject, define modular construction. And the answer is quite broad. So that was an interesting conversation. But certainly in terms of modern methods, for all the right reasons of constructing, using technology to support, how we put buildings up, that industry is I think recognised quite early on that they needed to develop more best practice guidance, commonality certainly in passive, and we're working with them to support that. So
I'm glad to hear that, because I think it's not just an inevitability in failure; it's an inevitability, but to make it successful. And that whole industry will want it to be successful, and will want to ensure that you and I and the general public remain confident in that kind of building.
Absolutely.
So all of us have a responsibility to make sure that they deliver it, but deliver it safely. And I have no doubt that engagement is going on, but it needs to continue. Maybe it started late. I'm not making a comment on that, but it does need to reflect the safety standards that are required and the expectations of. It comes back to competence as well, of course. Volumetric construction also requires the competence that they come together and are safely put together.
Yes,
and the passive fire safety is in place.
Absolutely, and they do recognise that, and it's quite an interesting journey that we're going on.
Good
with them. It's watch this space. So, in terms of all of the things we've spoken about, we know that there is and I hate to use this phrase because all these awful TV programs that people go on say, but we have been on a journey for quite a significant number of years. That the horizon is not, what's over the horizon, I don't think is yet visible completely. Do you think we're going in the right direction? Do you think it's going in the right direction and at the right pace, give or take the odd frustration?
Well, let's talk about pace first of all. You will know that immediately after the Grenfell tragedy, I was appointed to chair the Independent Expert Advisory Panel at the Government Department to find out if there were other buildings like Grenfell that might be at risk. And to all of our surprise, we found many buildings not of dissimilar, and we were concentrating at that stage of remember on external cladding. There are other features, but external cladding. And to find a very simple way to test that cladding and to find out if they're more like it. So I was also in a learning journey in that, but I happened to be chairing that panel. And so I think that we learned a lot from that early days. The pace the pace actually, I think, there is criticism, isn't there? There's always criticism that things aren't changing fast enough or quick enough. My observation, being part of some of that, and I'm not defensive about it, is it actually people have been working incredibly hard to make the changes required, because it did stop everyone in their tracks, Grenfell alone. And the lessons that need to be learned quickly. So I'm not critical of the pace at all. I think that to do it faster than that might have created some of those tensions we're talking about. And we've talked about a standard changing and how long that takes. Yeah. And of course, it is true to say that it's a terrible tragedy with 72 people losing their lives. They will be not only desperate for answers, but desperate that it doesn't happen again. And all of us are part of that solution. Yeah. So I'm not so concerned about pace, although it's important to not take our foot off the gas to maintain that. Whether with hindsight we needed to move in exactly the way we've moved, because we have moved into quite a regulatory regime in the result, a new building safety regulator, new constructions regulator. I think that was inevitable because of the scale and the nature and the findings that were apparent in that incident. I suspect that strengthening some of the existing regulations might have had a similar effect, and I was always slightly concerned that just changing regulations, for example, building regulations, when it was pretty apparent that some people had not actually met the regulations in the first place, doesn't necessarily mean people to comply. Yeah,
you failed. You didn't meet it, so here's some more that you
might not.
You're not going to meet either.
So it needs much. So I think Judith was right in saying it's not just about that. I think even with hindsight, I think we'll look back at it over a long period. It'll take a long time to come through all the implications and a significant. Just the building safety regulator getting through the high-rise residential buildings will be a number of years in terms of safety cases and so on. So I think on balance, it'll be interesting. We're all probably a bit too close to it to suggest that anything different. But there is a caucus of suggestion that maybe there was a different way of producing the same results without the bureaucracy around it. I'm not now close enough to know that's the case. And I don't think it would be right to want to try to undermine what's in place in any case, because it has highlighted some of those situations and issues like competency and standards and expectations and residents' expectations that are right to raise. So I don't think I would change anything now. But I wouldn't say that forever we'll see the regime not change, because it might get very heavy indeed if the building safety regulator regime itself, requiring safety cases, extends into much wider buildings. It will be almost impossible situation to maintain.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing with these things, isn't it? You've got to create something that is workable, as opposed to something that is. I can't remember who told me this, but there was a phrase they said, don't let the perfect spoil the good. And it has to be the best it can be, and it has to mitigate to the nth degree something like, Grenfell happening again. Absolutely. But as you say, if it gets embroiled in too much bureaucracy that effectively it becomes unworkable, then it will then... What will normally happens with that is that everything goes back to the lowest common denominator. So you end up almost back to where you started, like snakes and ladders.
Yes.
And I think that's the danger, that if it gets too wrapped up in bureaucracy, that it stalls. I don't think our general consensus is that it's not. There's a significant, the working groups, 1 to 12 have got a whole series of disciplines that we're all working to, and we sit on a number of those, and we can see the rationale behind them, and not only that, but the practical ability to be able to implement and people to use them.
But it does need to filter and permeate into SMEs as well, isn't it? So we've got some really big industries that are leading the field, and housing associations and architectural companies and so on. But it does need that's not in truth the bulk of the building industry.
No, the bulk of the building industry is effectively sole traders and SMEs. You're absolutely right.
And so I think we shouldn't forget that whilst people are doing some great good, and some of the biggest companies are really forging ahead and leading the way on all of those things we've talked about, we do need to ensure that the whole of the industry understands the rationale and the reason and puts in place the same practices.
It does, in relation to them and their size and what they do. Yeah, you can't apply, what's applicable to a tier one contractor.
No,
can't be applicable to a ma and pa, company that turns over, 750,000 a year with 2 employees. It's got to be representative and by scale and risk. So I think it's we are still. I'm going to have to use the word again. We are on this journey. It's going to be good to see where certain parts of it start to consolidate and how we start to use them and how they are managed. Because I think that's the other important thing. It's okay creating these systems, but somebody has to audit them and manage them. And if somebody isn't compliant, there has to be sanctions.
Yes.
What are those sanctions? Yes. That's going to be an interesting question. So, Ken, it's been wonderful to talk to you.
It's great to see you.
Thank you for being an advocate and coming along and having a chat. We do. We have quite a few people that want to come on this sofa now. But the notoriety of them and their experience and position is growing, and you're testament to that. We as you know, we take passive fire extremely seriously. It's everything we do is representing that industry, and we're glad and thankful for you to come and talk to us today.
Well, thanks to you. I'm grateful that you made me feel like a guest, not a victim.
Well, everyone comes here. We like to think anyone on the sofa is a friend.
And I have been around that broadest bit of industry for a very long time, and I've always enjoyed the technical expertise at ASFP and known some of your people for many years. So I'm grateful for your invitation. Actually, I look forward to meeting you on other occasions and seeing some of the other podcasts. So thank you very much indeed.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you, Ken. It's been good to get a view of where we are from you, and if I think it might be good, and I won't put you on the spot, but once we've gone through the document we were talking about in terms of the testing regimes, it might be good to come back and have a chat and get our views on what we think that looks like. Because of course, all of this, is helpful for people watching. It gives them, if we can expose more people to what they need to engage with and understand, then that's actually part of the job of improving everything that came out of the back of the Hackett report.
Right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity.
Thank you, Ken. Nice to see you.